Alright, let's continue. In the last video we managed to finish our first detail pass. We brought it to a level where we can now comfortably pose the character without worrying too much about the anatomy. Now we can dive into the posing and start working even deeper on the body details. First of all, you don't strictly need a finished base just to pose your character. If you focus entirely on the pose first, the base can always be adjusted to fit the character later, not the other way around. However, I personally find it much easier to pose a character when there is at least a simple surface present. And as a surface, I mean some shapes and muscles that we create on this stage. It helps me anchor them in space. Just relying on the floor lines at the bottom of the zebra screen doesn't quite work well enough for me. Also, you'll notice I didn't sculpt her weapon this time around, mostly because I already created for Ray last year, so we're good to go. Normally, when I start a model, I like to place the feet where they will connect to the base right at the beginning. Before I even touch the 3D transpose, I've already tested out some poses in 2D, sketching out beforehand. Let me experiment quickly. Trying to figure out the gesture entirely in 3D takes way too long for my workflow, so I locked all my favorite 2D concepts first and then bring that reaction into 3D. Since 3D introduces a lot more variables, we can then tweak and refine the forms to make the final pose look even better than the initial sketch. The process here is very similar to how we adjust proportions. It's all about constant reference matching once my 2D gesture is set. I get a real-world reference that match the specific movements of the character to help guide the anatomy transition. Posing a digital sculpture requires a lot of care, because we aren't working with a rigged game engine mesh. We are going to break the geometry quite a bit when bending the model. To minimize the mesh, you need to go little by little, carefully mask off sections, rotate and move components so that the underlying muscles and skeletal landmarks follow organically. This keeps your mesh clean and saves you from massive resculpting, later transferring the pose over. For me, the area that gives me the most trouble is always the pelvis and hip joints. When the legs spread wide or raise high from an actual pose, or even stylized for a more aesthetic, dynamic look, region deforms drastically. And since I use their base mesh, mean to work for both a clothed and anatomically version, keeping that joint from collapsing is always a challenge. I could easily solve this by throwing Dynamesh at this stage. However, I find preserving the clean topology of my base mesh much more useful in the long run. Going the Dynamesh route means I would have to duplicate, retopologize, and reproject the details later. Those extra steps end up taking more time than just cleaning, fixing, and the topology adjustment directly within the pose. With the pose finally locked in, we can go back and clean up any localized stretching we couldn't fix during the initial blockout. This is also the time to step up our subdivision levels if we haven't already. From here, we can truly refine the mesh, making the muscle groups pop and sharpening forms that weren't fully visible in the T-pose. Another crucial element to keep in mind in visual flow and structural balance, you need to look at the direction the model is guiding the viewer's eye and accurately locate the center of gravity. If the model leans too far forward without counterbalance, it will physically tip over once printed. I like to drop a temporary reference line, use a simple cube, or even draw directly over my viewport to check the balance. You want to make sure the piece looks stable from every conceivable angle. With the sculpting finalized, we can shift into polypaint. As always, I like to start by filling the entire model with a desaturated red base. I keep it desaturated because we need a much more vibrant saturated red later to map out the warmth in the fingers, knees and feet. Next, I bring in the subtle yellows for the areas that naturally catch ambient light, like the tops of the shoulders, the upper chest, and the thighs. To make this easier, you can use the mask by normals feature. This creates a mask base directly on your current camera view. Just position your camera from the angle where your primary light source will hit and bake the mask. Once it's set, drop your RGB brush intensity down to 25 or 30, keeping the strength low ensures you blend the tones smoothly without overpowering your base colors. At this stage, I also like to map out subtle subcutaneous details like veins using soft purples and greens. To blend it all together smoothly, I push the button RGB intensity up to 85 and lightly pass over the transition to fill the model. Of course, after that, you still need to calibrate your colors values to match the skin tones of the face using polypaint to adjust colors. To finish it off, I run another mask by normals, but inverted this time to manually build the deep shadows. Or I can use compute ambient occlusion to let the brush calculate the natural recessed shadows. I usually combine both methods, but feel free to use whatever workflow suits your style. And I think that's it. Another major phase of the project is complete. The pose is locked down and the primary skin tones are painted. Now, it's always a good idea to step away from the model for a bit. Small breaks allows you to come back with fresh eyes, make it more easier to spot minor issues that you might have missed after staring at the screen for hours. Thank you so much for sticking around until the end. If you learned something new today, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment about a character that you would like to see here as well. With that said, I'll see you in the next one.